in this talk, I want to bring in data from Turkish to show that factivity, which I'll define in a second, and intonation correlate. They're correlated phenomena. So we know that there are a variety of factors that might affect the overall intonation of a sentence. I want to name just two here. The first factor is what is under discussion. So what kind of implicit or explicit question is a sentence addressing? And so this can be illustrated by this exchange: who ate the apple? Ayşe ate the apple. Ayşe is pitch accented. And if I want to pitch accent, so nuclear pitch accent, the direct object, apple, the result is distinctly odd. So Ayşe ate the apple is not a good answer to who ate the apple. The second factor that I want to mention is the given, new, or contrastive status of particular strings in a sentence. These are related notions with the question-answer congruence facts from the previous example, but they're slightly different. So if I say, I should bake the apple and Beste ate it, baked and ate are receiving prominence there because they're contrasting with each other. Okay. So the question that I would like to ask here is whether the intonation of a sentence is also affected by the presupposed truth of a sentence that it embeds. So if you look at sentences like Mary knows that Susan ate an apple, or Mary thinks that Susan ate an apple, you have a big sentence, Mary knows that blah, and a small sentence that Susan ate an apple. And the question is whether presupposing the truth, pragmatically or semantically, of the sentence Susan ate an apple, does it affect the intonation of the whole? Okay. Yeah. So this is, and there's the converse way of asking the question. So does the intonation of the overall sentence affect the presupposed truth of the embedded sentence? Okay. So people have various thoughts on these questions, but I think so the overall consensus is that presupposed truth and intonation are orthogonal phenomena, except that there's recent work by Tannhauser and other people that show that that view might be misled, but in particular cases that you might ask me about in the question period. In this talk, I want to do exactly this. I want to bring in data from Turkish that suggests that presupposed truth and intonation are in fact correlated in some circumstances. So I want to continue by giving you some background about the fact of inference. This is illustrated for English in 1A. So if I say Mary knows that Susan ate an apple, this sentence entails and presupposes, if you care about that, that Susan ate an apple. Okay. It's odd to say Mary knows that Susan ate an apple in contexts where the embedded sentence is false. You can contrast this with 1B, Mary thinks that Susan ate an apple. This sentence doesn't imply that Susan ate an apple. You know, she could have, she could not have, doesn't matter. And so you might ask, when do we observe the fact of inference in English? The answer from English is sort of straightforward, at least on the surface. It's sufficient to pick the right attitude verb. So if you pick no, you observe the fact of inference. If you don't pick no, you don't. Okay. The inference seems to be encoded in the lexical semantics of the attitude verb. When you look at Turkish and other languages, what you see is that the choice of the attitude verb matters. So you have verbs like düşün, which roughly means think, which only occur in non-factive attitude reports, just like the English think. And you have verbs like unut, which roughly means forget, which only occur in factive attitude reports. And this is also roughly like the English forget. But what's very interesting is that in languages like Turkish, it's not enough. The choice of the verb is not enough, because there are verbs like bil, which I'll be focusing on today, which sometimes mean think and sometimes mean no. They're sometimes factive and sometimes non-factive. Okay? I mean, they occur in attitude reports that are factive and non-factive. And so here it becomes interesting to ask, when do we observe the fact of inference? So if you look at the sentence 2, this is a Turkish sentence. So you have Dilara, the subject, the matrix subject, the subject of the believer. And at the end, you have your attitude verb, biliyor. And in the middle, you have your embedded clause, so that it's raining. So Dilara yağmur yağdığını biliyor. And this sentence can be factive or non-factive. The question is under which conditions it is factive or non-factive. And what I show in this talk is that one of the factors that influences whether people interpret the sentence as a factive or non-factive sentence is intonation. Okay. Yes. And this next section is about showing you that the factive inference correlates with intonation. I was going to play these. I can't, so I will pronounce them. So you will hear two versions of this sentence. In one version, the first one that I'm going to say, I'm going to place the nuclear stress of the sentence on the matrix verb biliyor. So, Dilara yağmur yağdığını biliyor. Dilara yağmur yağdığını biliyor. So you should hear prominence on biliyor. And the second version that I will say to you is with nuclear focus on the embedded direct object, rain. Okay? Dilara yağmur yağdığını biliyor. Dilara yağmur yağdığını biliyor. Okay? Dilara yağmur yağdığını biliyor. Dilara yağmur yağdığını biliyor. And so the difference, this difference in intonation correlates with a difference in interpretation. The first sentence, when the matrix verb is accented, corresponds to a factive interpretation. And the second version of the sentence with stress on the embedded direct object corresponds to a non-factive interpretation. So before moving on, I should give you some background about the general intonational properties of Turkish. So here you have a basic sentence that doesn't involve any kind of attitude report, any sentence embedding. So this reads the translation. So maybe the Anamurans, the people from Anamur, a city in Turkey, maybe the Anamurans are buying Memoli's marinas. A lot of sonorants and place names. So Anamurlular Memoli'nin Anamurlular, this happens. Anamurlular Memoli'nin marinalarını alıyor galiba. Anamurlular Memoli'nin marinalarını alıyor galiba. So Anamurlular Memoli'nin marinalarını alıyor galiba. With nuclear stress on marinalarını, within the direct object. This is an expected pattern. So if you look at the prosodic word level intonation of Turkish, you should see this is the boxed areas. So you have low targets that İpek, whose work I'm following here, İpek proposes that low targets mark the left edge of prosodic words, and that the stressed syllable of prosodic words are accented with an H star. Okay, so you see two of these, LH star. At the end of the subject, Anamurlular, you see a little IP boundary that's marked by a low tone and an H minus. At the end of the sentence, this is marking the L percent is marking the right edge of a declarative big intonational phrase. And what I'm most interested here is how nuclear stress is realized, because we're going to identify this pattern in our attitude reports. So nuclear stress is identified by a variety of cues. So the first, in the boxed area, the first thing that you should note is a tone HN, which stands for a nuclear high tone. We'll see some instances of this in a second. What this is doing is that it creates a break between what precedes the nuclear word and the nuclear word. The nuclear word is accented regularly, or almost regularly. There's an LH star. And most importantly, maybe it's followed by a low tone that's sustained until the end of the big IP. Okay. Right, so, and now if we come back to our attitude reports, this is what they look like. So this is plotting my production of these attitude reports because it's cleaner. I have recorded naive participants as well, and you can ask me about that. There's a lot of variability. It's very interesting and hard. So, Dilara yağmur yağdığını biliyor galiba. With matrix verb accent, you see your nuclear high tone, low H star, that's the pitch accent, and then post-nuclear fall. And if you look, and this sentence means Dilara knows that it's raining, roughly. And if you slide the nuclear stress position on the embedded direct object, Dilara yağmur yağdığını biliyor galiba. you get this non-factive data thinks that it's raining, and you see that the nuclear sort of cues have shifted leftwards onto the direct object. Okay, so just to recap, so this phenomenon I'm calling the prosodic factivity alternation. So the availability of the factive inference correlates with the position of nuclear stress. If you stress the matrix verb, you get the factive inference. If you stress something in the embedded clause, you don't get the factive inference. If just, you can think of this as stressed bil, the verb bil means no, roughly. Unstressed bil means think. How do we know that this is not all in my head, that this is happening? I've conducted a pilot perception study, small scale, but it seems to be working. What I did was I played participants this sentences like 8. So this is English with Turkish word order. Merve, that her teacher in Paris has lived, knows. So Merve knows that her teacher has lived in Paris in 2 conditions. So either the embedded object, the embedded locative Paris was stressed, or the matrix verb biliyor was stressed auditorily. And I asked participants to tell me, upon hearing the sentence, whether it is or not the case that the teacher lived in Paris. Okay? Forced choice between the teacher lived in Paris. It's possible that the teacher hasn't lived in Paris. And people use this methodology to assess exactly this kind of inference. And what I got was, when the matrix verb was focused, 97% of the time, people said, yes, the sentence is factive. And when stress was shifted onto the direct object, or within the embedded clause, that rate dropped to 66%. This is suggesting that people are strongly accessing the factive, in fact, only accessing the factive interpretation with the matrix verb accent, and that rate drops when you shift the accent onto the embedded clause. Okay. These are novel findings. So in languages like Turkish, there are these verbs that can be factive or non-factive. And one of the factors that influence their interpretation is the prosody. The novel contribution that I'm sort of going to gloss over at this stage is that this happens with root sentences. Mary knows that Bill is tired. Other people have looked at more complex sentences with questions, or like, so does Mary know that Bill is tired, or Mary doesn't know that Bill is tired? If that kind of sentences. My contribution on Turkish sort of expands on this empirical landscape. And now, you might ask what's going on. How do we account for this prosodic factivity alternation? I want to, the existence of such facts raised 2 questions. So first of all, how does the factive inference arise? We saw in English that it might be lexically encoded. For languages like Turkish, we don't really want to do that because we see the same verb being factive and non-factive. So it's probably not part of its meaning itself. And the second question is how does the availability of the factive inference correlate with these intonational facts? So there are 2 naive, quote unquote, hypotheses that one might formulate. I want to formulate them and dismiss them. The first hypothesis states that these attitude verbs, these attitude reports of the form subject embedded clause bil, SCP bil, they come with the factive inference. They're, semantically they're factive, and positioning nuclear stress within the embedded clause, somehow defeats the factive inference. It makes it go away. Now the second hypothesis is that these kinds of attitude reports, subject clause bil, they're not factive. They're like think that P. But if you position nuclear stress in the right position on the matrix verb, you might trigger the factive inference. Okay. These are not very good hypotheses because, so let's look at the first one where you start out with a factive thing, you do something with the prosody, and then you get rid of the factivity. You can't do this in general. So there are verbs in Turkish like forget in 12, Ali yağmur yağdığını unuttu. Ali forgot that it was raining. If you take the nuclear stress and position it on the direct object, you are still a factive attitude report. It doesn't matter. You get these different pragmatic effects like narrow focus, You know, what is the thing that Ali forgot, or did Ali forget that it was raining or that it was snowing, that kind of thing. But it doesn't make your attitude report non-factive. And in general, stress, or like the position of prominence in sentences, it's not able to defeat semantic inferences. So take a sentence like 15, John's computer died. You can pronounce the sentence in any which way you want. You will still get the inference that John has a computer. You can't defeat semantic inferences with prosody. The second hypothesis that states that we start out with a non-factive attitude report and we do something with the prosody and end up with a factive attitude report, that's also problematic. And for a similar reason, if you have attitude verbs like this, Ali yağmur yağdığını düşünüyor, Ali thinks that it's raining. Now, if you take your nuclear stress and position it on the matrix verb, you still end up with something that means Ali thinks that it's raining. Okay, it's not because you've accented the matrix verb in this case that you end up with a meaning like Ali knows that it's raining. So, right, okay. So intonation doesn't seem to be enough. I mean, doesn't seem to be triggering or defeating the factive inference. What you do get due to intonation are inferences about, you know, what the question under discussion is, or what kinds of strings or constituents in the sentence are given. But crucially, you can't, either it's not possible or I don't know how to get from these kinds of inferences to the factive inference, which is a semantic thing, it seems. Right, so the alternative that I want to argue for is something of the following form. These attitude verbs, these attitude reports, subject, embedded clause, bil, can be factive or non-factive for reasons that are independent from intonation. I have thoughts about how you might get these two meanings, but they're not determining the intonation of themselves by virtue of their semantics. But maybe there are general principles, at least in Turkish, perhaps in English, that tell you that if you've presupposed an embedded clause, then under certain circumstances you're allowed to treat that embedded clause as given. Maybe sometimes you have to treat that embedded clause as given. And then once we're allowed to do that, we understand why you have to shift the stress away from the embedded clause onto here the matrix verb. Okay. So this kind of hypothesis, while appealing, raises concerns at first, because people like Wagner and Bühring and others have these examples that are strongly suggestive of the fact that intonation and the factive inference are completely independent phenomena. Okay. So if you look at the pair 2021, Mary wanted to go swimming in the lake. She didn't realize that it was too cold. Okay. Where main prominence falls on cold. You have a factive verb, realize. The speaker here is presupposing that the embedded clause is true, that the lake is in fact too cold. You have an embedded clause that's presupposed, but that's accented. So presupposition isn't really enough to move stress away from the embedded clause. And if you look at 21, although it was way too cold, Mary wanted to go swimming in the lake. She didn't realize that it was too cold. And here, making the embedded clause given, discourse given, does allow you to shift the position of nuclear stress onto the matrix verb. So what the relevant factor here seems to be the discourse givenness of the embedded clause, and not whether your verb is presupposing the embedded clause or not. Right? And then you can have things like, the Bertlets don't want to see you. Do they know that my mother is a senator? And here too, the speaker is presupposing that their mother is a senator, yet the embedded clause is accented. Okay, so yes, and so the question is, is Turkish like English in patterning like this, or maybe there's a different mapping between, givenness and presupposition and intonation in Turkish. So the examples in 23 seem to suggest that Turkish is slightly different from the English facts that we just saw. So I'm modifying Bühring's example here. If I say the Bertlets don't want to see you, I can say, well, they know that my mother's a member of the parliament. That's why they don't want to see me, okay? What we see is the embedded the embedded word, parliament, is accented. If you look at the Turkish counterparts of these examples, of this example, in the same context, you would still, so you'd say, annemin milletvekili olduğunu biliyorlar. You would accent the matrix verb. You would not accent the embedded, the word member of the parliament. If you did do that, annemin milletvekili olduğunu biliyorlar, you get this Stinks interpretation, which is not what we want. So in this, so you see that Turkish and English are sort of the accent is falling on the last word, parliament, or biliyorlar, but they're structurally reversed. So the word parliament is within the embedded clause in English, and the matrix verb bil is the matrix verb in English. So yeah. String-wise, the accent is in the same place, is what I mean. Structurally, the accent is in different places. Right? And here's a kind of example that I wanted to conclude with. There might be, I have the suspicion that there might be similar facts going on. Facts similar to Turkish might also exist in English. So if you have the sentence, the cops know that Mary committed a crime, okay? It's okay to accent, and compare that to the cops think that Mary committed a crime. It's okay to accent both know and crime, as far as I can tell. The cops know that Mary committed a crime. The cops think that Mary committed a crime. But only with the factive verb know are you allowed to de-accent the embedded clause out of the blue without much consequence. So I believe I can say the cops know that Mary committed a crime. And if you're in on the joke, this is okay. Nothing will go wrong, okay? It's odd, however, to say the cops think that Mary committed a crime. It means, you know, that's not, yeah, there are these additional inferences that we didn't want. Compare this to 26A and B, where the matrix verb is de-accented, and I'm gonna try to do this to the best that I can. But the embedded word, a crime, is accented, okay? And here the pattern flips. It's odd to say the cops know that Mary committed a crime. It's inviting inferences that we don't want about, you know, they're narrow focus inferences. Compare this to the cops think that Mary committed a crime. This is okay, yes. So I don't really understand yet what's going on here, but we see a similar relationship perhaps between the presupposed status of an embedded clause and the positions in which pitch accents are licensed, is what I mean. To conclude, I have presented evidence from Turkish that strongly suggests that intonation and factivity are correlated. This is unexpected given what we know. And perhaps English and Turkish are not so different. We just have to look a little bit closer to be able to understand in a unified manner what's going on there. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sunwoo. I really enjoyed your talk, thanks. So one question I had was, so you mentioned English possibly being like lexically specifying factivity, whereas Turkish is sort of more prosodically determined factivity. But if you consider example, so I think Tannhauser study mentions this, but if you consider verbs like discover, which is normally considered to be factive, so it presupposes the truth of its prejacent. You get examples like if you discover like this room is wombat proof, please let me know, where the speaker doesn't necessarily think it's wombat proof, so it doesn't like presuppose the truth of the thing, although like if it's presupposed, it's supposed to project outside the clause. So I was thinking whether if it could be like the factivity inference is sort of a matter of degree across languages, and whether in Turkish, so you have examples where it seems to be strongly determined by like the prosody case, and other cases where you mentioned where it's not, it's like categorically factive and it's really, prosody can't do anything else. Do you ever see like in between cases where there's like some heavy bias towards factivity inference where sometimes prosody can't trump that inference, but other times can, kind of thing. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure I followed the second point that you were making. So what kind of example are you looking for?
So are there verbs in Turkish that are heavily biased towards the factive inference, but not categorically factive? Like, not in all situations trigger factivity inference. And if
let me
so,
address the second point.
Which of the cues is stronger, the lexical bias or the prosodic bias?
So you would give Turkish speakers sentences of the form, John blaws that Mary's sick. Ask them whether it's factive, and they would tell you, 70% of the time they would say it's factive, and 30% of the time it's non-factive. I don't know. I haven't run the experiments. It's true that Judith Tannhauser finds that there is gradients across different kinds of presupposition triggers. Maybe. I haven't looked at it, but I have, the data that I showed you about the perception study, here, okay. So if you look at the results, in one condition, people were at ceiling, factive, and in the other condition, they were at 66%. So they're not at chance. I don't know what's going on, but there might still be a bias in favor of a factive-looking interpretation. The first point that you bring up very quickly, notice that in your sentences, so these are sentences by David Beaver and Judith Tannhauser and colleagues of the form, if you discover that this method is wombat-proof, I want to know. And sometimes discover is supposed to be a factive verb, but that sentence on its own does not presuppose that the method is wombat-proof. If you discover that the method is wombat-proof, I want to know. But there you have an if.
Yeah, but if it's a presupposition, it's supposed to project outside if or negation or things like that.
Yes. So what Tannhauser and colleagues find is that the intonation of sentences will affect the projective behavior of presuppositions. In all of the sentences that I've presented you, these are root clauses. So there is no, right? So yeah, Dilara knows that it's raining, Dilara thinks that it's raining. So in my cases, it's very fishy because we see the same intonational contrasts that Tannhauser finds, for instance.
I see.
But in our cases, it's not affecting projection, it's affecting the availability and root contexts of the.
Okay, so yours suggests that it's not there from the beginning. It's just it's not the blocking of presupposition because it's a root clause, but it's just not arising the activity.
Yeah, it's not. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Very interesting work. Lena Boris at Harvard. I was wondering, could you say more about how individual variation worked? And because you said that there was a lot and you ended up using your own pitch tracks.
Yes, so these are, I can show you, I believe I have them. So these are, from me, you see nice low, high, which is what we expect. And then, so this is a 24-year-old female speaker from Ankara. And what you see is, so the first sentence is supposed to be the factive sentence. So this is the people from Limonlu, so the Limonluans, know that Memoli called the marina, okay? Or the people from Limonlu think that Memoli called the marina on the bottom panel. What you see is that the embedded clause here, Memoli'nin marinayı aradığını, it's completely flat. There you don't see pitch accents in there. This is one kind of variation that I find. I mean, and I don't know yet if this is variation or if this person is in fact treating the embedded clause as discourse given and totally de-accenting the embedded clause. The second kind of variation that I find is if you compare the subject, limon lulular, in the first example, and in the second one, limon lulular. In the first one, you see at the right edge of that word an H minus, which is what we expect if the subject is phrased as a little IP. In the second sentence, that boundary tone is missing. I don't know why. This is the kind of variation that I find. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. Adam Royer from UCLA. So I'm working on a intonation model for Tatar, so this is really interesting. It was giving me some ideas of things to look at. But I was curious if you had any intuitions, or if you looked at the frequency with which people get the focus interpretation for the factive build. So if you give them the option, so you gave them the option of the factive reading and the non-factive, but if you also gave them a focus interpretation, would they, be more likely to go with a focus interpretation in that case? How does that compare to their interpretation of factivity?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would like to look at that. Yeah, so yes. So narrow focus interpretations, to my knowledge, shouldn't be the default option that people go for if they can accommodate a broad focus interpretation for a sentence. I believe. I have no evidence to back up this intuition. But I would be curious to, this is, if you do accent the embedded clause, yes, you're right, you do get a narrow focus factive reading, which I haven't, examined. Very interesting.
Great. We have time for one or two from the entire audience now. Do you have a question? Anyone else?
Christine, UMass. I just had a further question about the individual variability you were talking about. So you said that you saw variability in whether the liminal lens, are phrased as a little IP or not, and also whether every single content word sort of gets a pitch accent or not. But what I'm wondering is, do you see in the various people you recorded, have you seen individual variability in the placement of, the nuclear stress on the matrix verb versus material and embedded clause when you, with respect to the factive inference?
So yes, no, so the question is asking, we see all these, okay, so each time that I present these sentences in contexts that support the factive reading, I get the nuclear stress on the matrix verb, and for contexts that favor non-factive readings, I get the nuclear stress somewhere else. The cues that indicate the position of the nuclear stress vary, so we have to look at multiple cues at once. They might show, variation across speakers or within the speaker, but you can always reliably tell that in the factive cases, you get, nuclear stress in one single position. In the non-factive cases, you get it in another position. That's true. Yeah.
Thank you. Richard Hatcher from University of Buffalo, sorry. I've read that when accents occur at an IP boundary, they are occasionally attenuated. You won't get as much prominence when it occurs sort of at the default position. And I wonder if you were to get someone to record this monotonically, so where there's not a lot of prominence, where it's not so particularly easy to tell which word is getting the nuclear accent, which of those two readings you might get. I don't know if that's something you've looked at or you want to look at.
I haven't, but that is something that I would like to look at. What you're suggesting is give them a flat pitch contour, the sentence, flatten everything. Yeah. There might be other cues than F0 to the position of nuclear stress, loudness, duration. Yeah. Those are all things that I want to manipulate and play around. Yeah.